Military operations never warn when they will change course. No sirens, no special alarms. Sometimes the difference between a mission's success and a complicated outcome lies in the hands of a single man who can read what others can't even see. This is the story of a sergeant whose knowledge of something as simple as fog saved 150 American lives in an operation that should have been routine, but which turned into one of the most tense moments of his career. We are in a mountainous region where the climate changes in a matter of minutes and where each decision can mean the success or failure of a mission with soldiers who fully trust their superiors. The mission was clear: to perform an air jump in a designated landing zone, establish a defensive position and wait for the ground reinforcement that would arrive in approximately 6 hours. 150 paratroopers were ready, equipped and mentally prepared for what was to come. The briefing had been conducted 3 times. Each platoon leader knew his area of responsibility. Each soldier knew exactly where he should be as soon as his feet touched the ground. If you are enjoying this amazing story, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time when you are watching this documentary. Your participation is very important to us. But there was a man on that base who was not satisfied. His name was Sergeant Miller, a veteran with 17 years of service, 12 of them in airborne operations. Miller was not the kind of soldier who questioned orders for pleasure or created unnecessary problems. On the contrary, he was known for his exemplary discipline and his almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they manifested. That morning, as the other soldiers checked their equipment and adjusted their straps, Miller was standing at the entrance of the hangar, staring at the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. There was something in the air that bothered him. It wasn't just a sensation, it was something he could see, feel, and even smell. The humidity was different. The wind, which normally blew from the west at that time of year, was coming from the southeast, bringing with it an earthy odor that Miller recognized very well. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the wind touch his face, sensing the temperature, pressure, density of that air mass that slowly moved toward the planned landing zone. Miller had grown up in the mountains of West Virginia, where learning to read the weather was not a hobby, but a necessity for survival. His grandfather, a man who had spent his entire life working in the forests, had taught him since he was a child to observe the signs that nature offered. As trees bowed before a storm, as animals changed their behavior when atmospheric pressure dropped, as sunlight behaved differently when a mass of moist air approached. They were lessons that most people would consider superstition or outdated knowledge, but for Miller, they were survival tools as important as his professional equipment. He walked to the control tower, where the operations officer was reviewing the latest weather data. The report was favorable. Clear skies, visibility of 15 kilometers, winds of only 8 knots, stable temperature. Miller asked permission to speak and, with respect due to the military hierarchy, expressed his concern. He explained that, based on his experience and the conditions he was observing, there was a very high probability that a dense haze would form over the landing zone in the next 3 hours, reducing visibility to virtually zero at the exact time the planes were supposed to reach the launch point. The operations officer looked at the sergeant with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The weather data was clear, provided by modern equipment and by meteorologists trained specifically for that type of mission. How could a sergeant, no matter how experienced, contradict technical reports based on satellites, weather balloons, and computer models? Miller perfectly understood the hesitation of the officer. He was not trying to challenge the authority or question the competence of the experts. He was just sharing what his years of experience and his empirical knowledge told him. The officer decided to listen to him. He asked Miller to explain in detail what he was observing and why he believed the official reports were incorrect. Miller began by pointing to the horizon line, where an almost imperceptible layer of denser air was beginning to form, and explained that this phenomenon, combined with the unusual direction of the wind and the moisture it could feel in the air, indicated that a thermal inversion was about to occur. In simple terms, a mass of cold air was being pushed under a mass of warmer air, creating a trap for moisture. When this happened in mountainous regions, especially at that time of year, the result was almost always the same: sudden and extremely dense fog. The operations officer asked some technical questions, testing Miller's knowledge. I wanted to know about dew points, about temperature gradients, about local wind patterns. Miller responded to all of them with a precision that surprised not only the officer, but also the meteorologists in the room. It was clear that this sergeant was not making random assumptions. He had a deep and practical understanding of meteorology, gained through decades of direct observation and field experience. But there was a problem. The mission was scheduled to take place in less than 2 hours. To cancel it on the basis of a sergeant's prediction, contradicting official reports, would be an extremely difficult decision to justify, especially considering the strategic implications of that operation. Ground forces were already on the move, air support was being coordinated, multiple units depended on the success of that jump. Delaying or canceling would mean reorganizing a complex operation that took weeks to plan. The commander of the operation was called to the control tower. He was a major with many years of experience, a respected officer who had a reputation for making difficult decisions when needed, but who was also not afraid to trust his men. He listened intently as Miller repeated his analysis, this time in even more detail. The major asked the question everyone was thinking: what was Miller's level of certainty in his prediction? Miller did not hesitate. He said he was 90% sure the fog would form, and that when it did, it would be so dense that pilots would not be able to see the landing zone, let alone perform a safe paratrooper launch. The major looked out of the tower window, observing the perfectly blue sky, with no single cloud in sight. It was hard to imagine that, in a few hours, that same sky could be covered by an impenetrable fog. But there was something in the way Miller spoke, in the confidence that transpired not as arrogance, but as knowledge-based certainty, that made the major pause and seriously consider that possibility. He asked meteorologists to review their data specifically for signs of heat inversion or fog formation. The experts worked quickly, inserting new parameters into their models and analyzing data from nearby weather stations. 15 minutes later, forecasters came back with an update. Although their main models did not indicate fog, they did find some patterns that could, under certain specific conditions, result in local fog formation. It was not high enough to cancel the mission based on this alone, but it was high enough to create a reasonable doubt. On the one hand, it had official reports and computer models saying that everything was fine to proceed. On the other, there was an experienced sergeant betting his reputation on predicting an impending problem. What happened next is something that is still taught in military academies as an example of leadership and decision-making under pressure. The major decided to postpone the mission for 3 hours. He did not cancel it completely, but determined that they would wait to see if Miller's prediction would be confirmed. It was a decision that required courage, because it meant taking responsibility for delaying an important operation based more on intuition and human experience than on technical data. The 150 soldiers were informed of the delay, and although some were frustrated at having to wait, most accepted the decision without question. Military discipline teaches that there are reasons for every order, even when those reasons are not immediately apparent. Miller returned to the entrance of the hangar and continued to observe the horizon. Other soldiers began to join him, curious about what exactly he was seeing that had caused them to postpone the mission. Miller patiently explained, pointing to subtle details in the landscape. As the light was beginning to change in quality, as an almost invisible mist began to form in the distant valleys, as the temperature seemed to be falling despite the sun already being high in the sky. For most soldiers, it still seemed like a perfectly normal day, but some veterans began to notice what Miller was describing. An hour passed. The sky remained clear, visibility remained excellent. In the control tower, the major was beginning to question his decision. Meteorologists did not detect significant changes in atmospheric conditions. The operations officer quietly suggested that it might be time to resume the mission. But the major decided to wait for the full 3 hours. He had trusted Miller enough to postpone the operation, and now he would trust him to the end. The second hour brought the first visible signs. A light haze began to appear in the lower areas of the terrain. It was nothing dramatic, just a slight blur that many attributed to the normal warming of the soil moistened by the morning sun. But Miller knew better. That was no ordinary evaporation. It was the beginning of the phenomenon he had predicted. Thermal inversion was consolidating, and moisture was being trapped closer and closer to the ground. He informed the major that the process was underway and that dense fog would appear within the next half hour. And then it happened. As if someone had flipped a switch, fog began to form quickly. In a matter of 20 minutes, visibility in the scheduled landing zone dropped from 15 kilometers to less than 50 meters. A dense white wall completely covered the area, making it impossible to distinguish even large objects at close range. It was exactly the kind of condition where a parachute jump would be not only risky, but extremely complicated. The soldiers would have jumped without adequate visual references to judge height, speed, or position. The chances of problems during operation, including inadequate unit dispersion, would be extremely high. The silence in the control tower was absolute. Everyone looked out the window, seeing one of the most accurate and unlikely weather forecasts they had ever witnessed. The major picked up the radio and personally thanked Sergeant Miller, acknowledging that his decision to trust that man's knowledge had just saved potentially dozens of lives and certainly avoided the complete failure of the mission. Meteorologists also recognized that their models, while technically sophisticated, had failed to capture the local nuances that only direct experience and empirical knowledge could detect. The mission was rescheduled for late afternoon when the fog finally cleared. The jump was successfully carried out. All 150 soldiers landed safely in the designated zone, and the operation achieved all its tactical objectives. But the true success of that day was not measured by the fulfillment of the mission, but rather by the fact that all those men returned home when the time came, with no unnecessary casualties, no avoidable accidents. And this was only possible because a sergeant had the courage to speak when he saw danger approaching, and because a major had the wisdom to listen. This story teaches us something fundamental about leadership, knowledge, and humility. We live in an era where we rely immensely on technology, on data, on computational models. And rightly so, because these tools are extraordinarily powerful and accurate in most situations. But there are times when human experience, the empirical knowledge accumulated through years of direct observation, can perceive patterns that algorithms do not capture. It is not about choosing between science and intuition, between technology and experience. It is about recognizing that both have value, and that true wisdom lies in knowing when to trust each other. Sergeant Miller wasn't a trained meteorologist. He had no advanced degrees or technical certifications in atmospheric sciences. What he had was something equally valuable: decades of close observation, a deep understanding of the natural patterns of his region, and the ability to read signals that most people just don't notice. His grandfather had taught him to respect nature, to observe it humbly, and to recognize that it follows predictable patterns for those who learn the right language. Those teachings, passed down from generation to generation in the mountains of Virginia, have proven to be as valuable as any modern technology when applied at the right time. History also teaches us about leadership. The major who ran that operation could easily have dismissed Miller's concern. After all, he had official reports, trained experts, and a whole hierarchy of authority that supported the original plan. But great leaders do not just do what is easy or what is more defensible bureaucratically. They do what is right. And on that day, what was right was to listen to an experienced soldier who was raising a legitimate red flag, even if it meant going against technical consensus. There is a military principle that says no plan survives contact with the enemy. But there is another principle, less talked about but equally important, which says that the best operations are those that incorporate knowledge from all levels of the hierarchy. The generals plan the strategy, but it is the sergeants who understand the tactical reality on the ground. It is the foot soldiers who perceive the details that the maps do not show. An organization that only listens up is doomed to make avoidable mistakes. An organization that creates channels for knowledge to flow in all directions is much more likely to succeed. After that day, Sergeant Miller was awarded a medal of recognition for his exceptional service. But for him, the real reward was to see all those 150 men return safely to their families. He did not seek glory or recognition. He just did what any responsible soldier should do. He used his knowledge and experience to protect his comrades. In his own words, during a later interview, he said he just did what his grandfather would have done, which was to observe nature with respect and act on what she was communicating. The fog Miller predicted lasted about 4 hours. Throughout this time, the landing zone remained completely invisible from the air. The pilots who were supposed to have carried out the original launch later confirmed that it would be impossible to have completed the mission safely under those conditions. It was calculated that if the operation had proceeded as originally planned, there would be serious risks and significant operational complications. All this was avoided because of a man who could read the fog. Sergeant Miller's story quickly spread throughout the military. It has become a case study in several military academies, not just about meteorology or operations planning, but about leadership, communication, and the value of experience. Some commanders began to incorporate into their briefings a specific phase where soldiers of any rank could raise concerns based on their local experience or knowledge, creating an environment where empirical knowledge was valued as much as technical data. Miller continued serving for another 5 years before retiring. During this time, he trained several other sergeants in the art of natural observation, teaching them to pay attention to the signs that nature constantly offers. Some of his students saved lives on their own missions by applying the lessons Miller had shared. The knowledge his grandfather had passed on to him in the mountains of Virginia was now being passed on to a new generation of soldiers around the world. There is something deeply significant about the way traditional knowledge and empirical wisdom can complement modern technology. It is not a battle between the old and the new, between analog and digital. It is about recognizing that different forms of knowledge have different strengths, and that true excellence comes from integrating all these forms in a harmonious way. Computational models are excellent for processing large amounts of data and identifying patterns at a macro scale. But direct human experience is irreplaceable when it comes to perceiving local nuances, sensing subtle changes in the immediate environment, applying cultural and historical context to a specific situation. What Miller did that day was not magical. It wasn't luck. It was methodical application of knowledge acquired through careful observation over many years. It was the ability to recognize patterns based on similar previous experiences. It was the courage to speak up even when your opinion contradicted technical authorities. And it was the humility to present his concerns respectfully, without arrogance, simply sharing what he knew so others could make informed decisions. For the 150 men who were scheduled to jump that day, Sergeant Miller is a silent hero. Most people will never hear of him. There are no films about his story, no best-selling books reporting his exploits. But for those soldiers and their families, he is the man who allowed parents to return to their children, husbands to return to their wives, children to return to their parents. He is the man who made the difference between life and death through the simple act of observing and communicating. The mission that was postponed that day was successfully completed a few hours later. Tactical objectives were achieved, the operation was considered a complete success, and none of the 150 soldiers suffered even one injury. In official reports, there is a footnote mentioning the delay due to unforeseen weather conditions. But those who were there know the full truth. They know it was much more than unforeseen conditions. He was a man with exceptional knowledge and the courage to use it, combined with a leader wise enough to listen. This story reminds us that important actions do not always come in the form of spectacular deeds. Sometimes the most significant decisions are in preventing problems before they happen, in avoiding difficulties through preparation and knowledge, in protecting people through wisdom rather than just reacting to situations. Sergeant Miller didn't need dramatic action that day. He faced no direct challenges. But he saved lives through his careful observation and his timely communication. For those who study leadership, this story offers invaluable lessons. It teaches us that good leaders create environments where information can flow freely, where experience is valued regardless of patent, where legitimate concerns are heard and taken seriously. The major who led that operation demonstrated great leadership not only in making the difficult decision to postpone the mission, but in creating from the outset an environment where Miller felt comfortable sharing his concerns. In organizations where the hierarchy is too rigid, where subordinates are afraid to question or raise concerns, preventable disasters happen regularly. The fog Miller predicted eventually dissipated, as all fog always does. The sun won, visibility returned, and life went on. But the lesson of that day remained. It remained in the memory of all who were present, in the military doctrine that was updated to embody that experience, and in the hearts of the 150 men who were saved without even fully knowing the danger they had avoided. There is an ancient proverb that says experience is the best teacher. But there is an even deeper truth. Wisdom lies in learning not only from our own experience, but from the experience of those who came before us. Sergeant Miller learned from his grandfather, who learned from his own father, who learned from previous generations of men and women who lived close to nature and learned their patterns. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, passed down through stories and practical teachings, has proven to be as valuable as any modern technology when applied at the right time. Nowadays, the military incorporates both advanced technology and training in natural observation. It is recognized that both are necessary, that neither replaces the other completely. The best results come when technical data and human experience work together, when computers and intuition form a partnership rather than competing with each other. This synthesis of old and new, technological and natural, calculated and meaningful, represents perhaps the best hope for navigating the complex challenges we face in any field of human activity. Sergeant Miller never sought fame or recognition for his actions that day. When asked how he felt about saving so many lives, he simply replied that he was doing his job, that any experienced sergeant would have done the same. But the truth is that not everyone would have the same combination of knowledge, courage, and humility needed to act as he did. Not everyone would have spent decades observing natural patterns. Not everyone would have the courage to speak out against technical consensus. Not everyone would have the humility to present their concerns in a respectful and productive manner. Sergeant Miller's story and the fog he predicted is more than just an interesting tale. It is a parable about the value of attentive observation, about the importance of respecting knowledge in all its forms, about the need to create environments where truth can be spoken and heard, regardless of hierarchy or convention. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest achievements are those that prevent problems, that the most important actions may lie in simply being attentive and willing to act on what we observe. The 150 men who should have jumped that day eventually completed many other missions. Some retired honorably, others continued to serve. Some rose through the ranks, becoming leaders themselves who made critical decisions. And when it came time to make those decisions, many of them remembered that day when a sergeant saved their lives by knowing how to read a fog, and a major saved their lives by knowing how to listen. These lessons shaped the way they led, the way they treated their subordinates, the way they valued different forms of knowledge. In a world that often values only what can be quantified, measured, and processed by computers, Sergeant Miller's story reminds us that there are forms of knowledge that transcend data. There is wisdom that comes from patient observation, from connection with the natural environment, from attention to detail that others ignore. This wisdom does not replace science or technology, but complements them in essential ways. True excellence comes from recognizing the value of both and knowing when to apply each. Sergeant Miller's legacy goes beyond that specific day. It inspired a new appreciation for natural observation within the military. Training programs have been developed to teach soldiers to read environmental signals, to pay attention to subtle changes in climate, terrain, animal behavior. It has been recognized that in remote and hostile environments where technology may fail or not be available, the ability to read the environment using only direct observation can mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. The fog Miller predicted that day has become a metaphor for all the challenges that can be predicted and avoided if we have the wisdom to pay attention and the courage to act. How many problems in our lives could be avoided if we were more attentive to the warning signs? How many difficulties could be prevented if we created environments where people with relevant knowledge felt comfortable speaking? How many complicated situations could be avoided if we valued experience as much as data, trained intuition as much as computational models? These are questions that go far beyond the context of operations. They apply to business, where ignoring warning signs can lead to significant losses. They apply to medicine, where the clinical experience of the doctor can detect things that tests do not show. They apply to education, where experienced teachers can identify problems that standardized tests do not capture. They apply to all areas of human life where empirical knowledge and direct experience have irreplaceable value. Sergeant Miller taught us that saving lives sometimes means having the courage to postpone, to pause, to question when something doesn't feel right, even when all the official indicators say it's okay. He taught us that great knowledge can come from humble sources, that wisdom does not require advanced degrees, only patient observation and an open mind. He taught us that true heroism often happens in the moments of decision that precede action, not in the spectacular actions that follow. And so, while that haze cleared many years ago, the lesson remains clear as the sky after the storm. Pay attention. Value experience. Listen to those who have relevant knowledge, regardless of their position. Have the courage to speak up when you see danger. Have the humility to listen when others speak. These are the lessons that saved 150 lives that day, and they are lessons that can save countless more if we have the wisdom to apply them. The story of Sergeant Miller and his reading of the fog is a testament to the best of human nature. Knowledge gained through patience, wisdom shared with humility, courage exercised with responsibility, and leadership demonstrated through genuine listening. It is a story that deserves to be told and retold, not just in military academies, but anywhere people make decisions that affect other lives. May we all have some of Sergeant Miller in us. The attention to observe, the knowledge to interpret, the courage to speak, and the humility to serve. May we all have some of that major in us. The wisdom to listen, the courage to trust, and the willingness to make difficult decisions when necessary. And that we can create environments in our organizations and communities where knowledge can flow freely, where experience is valued, and where the safety and well-being of people always come first. In the end, as we reflect on this extraordinary story of foresight, courage, and salvation, we are reminded that there are greater forces that guide the steps of those who serve with honor and attention. Sergeant Miller's knowledge, passed down through generations, the Major's wisdom in listening, and the protection that enveloped those 150 men that day, all point to a deeper truth. In critical moments, when right decisions are made and lives are spared, we recognize the hand of divine providence operating through men and women of goodwill. May the Lord God continue to bless those who serve with dedication, protect those who risk their lives in defense of others, and grant wisdom to those who must make important decisions. May He always give us the vision to see beyond the obvious, the courage to act on what we observe, and the humility to recognize that in the end all good deeds and protections come from His infinite grace.